last plenary session of the EuroDIG. I hope you're still full of energy. We're going to have very interesting discussions about the big questions. Over the last 2 days, I heard already the keywords popping up several times. Fragmentation, digital sovereignty, jurisdiction. And all those questions we will discuss today in the session that is called Internet Fragmentation and Digital Sovereignty Implications for Europe. With me is my co-moderator, Wolfgang Kleinwächter, who most of you know. He was a former director of the board of ICANN. He's a professor emeritus of the University of Aarhus, and he is one of the authors of the report for the World Economic Forum on Internet Fragmentation.
Okay, thank you and welcome. This is Paul Fehlinger, my co-moderator. He is with the Internet and Jurisdiction, where they discuss and in detail the legal dimension of all the issues. And we have decided to share our responsibilities here. We have divided the discussion into 2 blocks. In the first block, we want to figure out what is the understanding of fragmentation. And in the second block, what we can do to manage or to minimize the negative effects of fragmentation. So the second part will be moderated by Paul. He is my co-moderator in the first section, and he also wants to organize the input from the floor, because we want to invite you already from the very early minute to go to the microphone and to make some intervention and comments if you think this is needed.
And I also have the microphone in the hand in order to take the D in EuroDIG very serious.
Because after 2 days, we are not prepared for long speeches and long interventions, so we want to do it as interactive as possible.
And before I introduce our very, very distinguished panelists, I want to very quickly thank the organization team. We had amazing discussions over the past months and about this issue, and I hope we can have similar discussions and better discussions today here. And I also want to thank Anya Gengo, who's going to be the reporter of this session, and I want to thank Nareen Kachatrin, which is the remote moderator, and also welcome everybody who's joining remotely. With us today on the panel is Göran Marby, who's the president and CEO of ICANN. We have Elfa Gylfadóttir, who's the director of the Icelandic Media Commission and chair of the Council of Europe Steering Committee on Media and Information Society. We have John Frank, who's vice president of EU Governmental Affairs at Microsoft. Marietje Schaake, a member of the European Parliament for the Liberals. And
Roberto Viola.
and Roberto Viola. And Megan Richards, Principal Advisor at the European Commission, who's filling in for Roberto Viola, the Director of DG Connect, who's going to come in 10 minutes or so.
I think it's more, that's why I'm sitting here. It's going to be a bit more, but he's coming.
He's coming.
Okay.
Fantastic. Wolfgang, please.
Thank you. By the way, Paul mentioned that 3 people, windsurf, Bill Drake, who is here in the first row, and I myself wrote a study for the World Economic Forum in Davos this January about internet fragmentation. The subtitle is an overview. Because, you know, it was when we started it was totally unclear what internet fragmentation means. If you listen to many statements, this comes back again and again and again. And what we have discovered in the process of preparing the study is there is really a broad range of different understandings of fragmentation. And this is different today from what it was 20 years ago. 20 years ago, fragmentation was also labeled balkanization of the internet. Because in the early 90s, we had this war on the Balkan between different states. And the fear 20 years ago was that different networks will emerge and then fight each other. I think this is water under the bridge. This has gone. This is not a problem anymore. Fragmentation today is different. And we discovered in our study that as a natural process, if you get a network with now 3 or nearly 4 billion users, that subsystems emerge which create a life of their own. And the question is this good or is this bad? Is this very natural? So we said and concluded that the intention is important in this process if new subsystems emerge. And so we said it's not good or bad. it depends from the concrete circumstances. And furthermore, we discovered also that there are 3 layers on fragmentation. We have a technical dimension, we have a business dimension, and we have a policy dimension. On the technical layer, the question is alternate routes, new root servers or something like that. On the business dimension, the question is walled gardens and, is this fragmentation? On the political layer is national internet segments. Is this fragmentation? So let me start with the first question to Göran. ICANN has the slogan, one world, one internet. So is this in danger now? So that means we will have 2 or 3 internet in the future. There's probably not 2 worlds, but one world, how many internet?
Thank you very much for that simple question. How long time do I have to answer it? I think that the first question is really how many internets do we actually have? Because the fantastic thing with internet is that it's almost perfectly designed for human interaction. And the fantastic thing is also that we're all a part of internet. If we were all, God forbid, or for a second close down all our computers and mobile phones, internet would actually be smaller. And for the first time ever, a technology which has been evolving so fast, and I think one of the reasons why it's evolved so fast is because it is the only technology ever that human beings, people, not corporations, not organizations, has created by using it. Every minute, every second, every day, there is someone who sits at home and posts an ID or do something and connects to internet and does something independently of governments, corporations, anything. And it's a fantastic technology with human interaction. So maybe we're all internet. And this capability, this enormous capability of human interaction, creating this thing together what we call the internet, is something I think is extremely important to behold. Looking at it going, of course now people will start talking about how do we evolve this thing? How do we make it different? And there's a balance between, because we need to make it better. I've said a couple of times in the last couple of days that now when we enter the final phase of the transition, hopefully, we kind of written the first chapter of the book of internet, and now we're going to write the rest of the book together. And of course we have to develop, we have to change, but we should make sure that we don't miss this thing, that people can get online and by that creating internet. And I think that that's what we talk about really when we talk about in ICANN, doing our part together with our partners, together with everybody else who creates this thing called internet. That is an essential thing to make sure that we can sustain in the future as well. So it's not a technical, we are in the technical part of it. We supply a service to the technical community, but together with all our partners, I think that's one of the most important things we can have.
Thank you. Let me add one question. 20 years ago, there was a debate about alternate routes. And we had different options and then say, okay, this can be then connected or whatsoever. So more or less the route as we have it today, the so-called legacy route, is accepted as the route with the 13 root servers. Now some new proposals come up with the Yeti project, so to add additional root servers. Do you see a risk that we will move again into a situation where we have competitive routes? Or is this because you are host of the root server advisory committee and they have to deal with this? What is ICANN's position with this new emerging discussion about Yeti and friends?
I don't think we would be surprised if I say we think it's the system that we have today with the essence that is not a bad system. Humbly enough, we also know that we need to talk about evolvement of internet. But if you go back to what I said earlier, that we have a system now that is used by 3 billion users. And there's a lot of, I think we're going to go into this later, but these 3 billion users should be able to connect to each other. And if someone comes up with an alternative model, they have to kind of copy the 3 billion users already there. And we have to think about this from a human perspective rather than a technical one. With that said, we have to figure out new ways of improve ourselves. And that is what ICANN, to have ICANN is really about supporting this.
Thank you very much. Let's move from the technical dimension to the economic dimension. John, what we see not only in big companies like Facebook, Google, Apple, or whatever, that they build their own small kingdoms. They want to connect their customers in the best way, to serve their customers in the best way. And the result is so-called wallet gardens, and sometimes with very small doors and gates. So it's difficult to go from one garden to another one. So that means, how do you see from a corporation like Microsoft this development, not only from your personal perspective as a Microsoft person, but in a general way? We have to debate on Microsoft, on Facebook, zero rating, and on Apple and all this. So just to give you a general evaluation of this.
Well, I think it's an interesting question to think about the consequences. I don't think any of the companies set out, from a commercial point of view, to fragment the internet. And yet, the question and the framing of fragmenting the internet is quite useful to ask ourselves, are there consequences from different commercial activities? And from a purely commercial point of view, we have customers, and we want to serve them with the best things we can. And when you have a customer, you'd like to think that you can choose the services that you're best at providing them. And in the end, it's the economic models in the internet are varied, but we all try to figure out how to do it profitably as well. And so you're going to have different approaches, and some people make their money on hardware, other people make it on advertising, some people have a licensing model. And so there's different competing platforms that serve people in different ways, and ultimately consumers do have the choice to which platform they want to spend their time on. And here in Brussels, we've been having a debate last year about platform regulation, and how should platforms be regulated? Is there a need? And I think that there's an intuitive sense that platforms do require some regulatory principles. Whether or not you can have a general regulation on platforms is another matter. Competition law principles clearly apply. And so I think it's a good discussion about, are there problems that aren't met by competition rules? But as we refine the discussion, we can get closer to that. And some of the, just might give one example of a topic is data portability. And so if I use Office 365 or Xbox, how do I take my data with me? And I think it's a perfectly legitimate question. We wouldn't want to say, well, everything you wrote on Office 365 in using Word, you don't get that back, right? Clearly, you need to be able to get that information. And yet there's some other questions about it at a more detailed level about metadata and things that are just more difficult to sort of work through. But as a general principle, I think people want it. And I think it's a perfectly fair thing. And you just need to sort of work through whether it's commercially, or if the commercial process fails, you have to do it through regulation.
Okay, let me also hear one question. This is related partly also to the question of standards, of open standards. So that means we know from the past that standard wars are wars for market domination. So the internet is based on open standards. Interoperability is a key issue. So that means any comment on the question of standards, open standards, and interoperability among, clouds, for instance, this is also a good issue here?
It's important to, it is important to have open standards, and I think generally it's defining, where is there market failure, where a standard isn't working or they're not being adopted. But in the abstract, I think everybody in the industry at this point, there's broad consensus on open standards.
Okay, so let's move to the policy dimension. So that means we have the concept of some countries which are not here in the room, like China, which says, okay, we have to have cyber sovereignty as the key principle. National internet segments is another language which is used in certain intergovernmental regulations. It means we have a global internet and then national segments, because jurisdiction is still based on national law. In the second part, we will go deeper into this, but in this first round, I want just to ask Elfa, because she is a member in a committee in Iceland, which deals also with the media, and national culture is an important element. So that while this is not basically the internet, but now culture is distributed to a high degree via the internet. And do you see a conflict here between protection of national culture and then the globalized internet?
Yes, absolutely. I think I want to start a little bit because the Steering Committee on Media and Information Society in the Council of Europe, we used to be just dealing with traditional media. But then now it's impossible to talk about media without talking about the internet, obviously. I think the reason why the Council of Europe and the Steering Committee get into this business, if you can say like that, is that we started to see trends, commercial, technical and governmental fragmentation. I mean, we had countries who were cut off, member states who were cut off literally from the internet. All sorts of things started to come up. And that is also the reason why the Council of Europe is now exercising these standard setting on information society, setting out these rules that we all agree on, looking at different aspects from a human rights perspective. But having said that, we are also still dealing with traditional media, which is the other part that we are doing. And traditional media is a very linked to the jurisdictions of these 47 member states. So the globalization that we want to see, we don't want to have a fragmented internet and so forth, but still the internet and the globalization is impacting the individual jurisdiction. Just to name an example of this dilemma that we are in, is that in the Nordic states, for example, about 20% of the advertising revenues of the media, total advertising revenues, are going to the big companies in the US. So we also have positive obligations as nation states within the Council of Europe to provide for pluralism, for diversity, and so forth. But how are we then going to do that when we don't have business models for the media anymore? So this is kind of the conflict that we are seeing. So I think that there was an article in the New York Times just a week ago discussing cultural issues and whether linguistic and cultural issues, is fragmentation. And I think in a certain degree it can be fragmentation, but you have to apply, of course, the fundamental principles in this aspect, not fragmenting the internet, but then at the same time you have maybe to find some schemes or funds or something like that to provide for this cultural diversity and language and so forth that we all want to have in the different European states.
So you said, how to do it, and you just made a proposal which is a good mixture. So is the risk that we move towards protectionism? If you go this, in Europe we discuss also now quota for Netflix and things like that. So is,
yes.
How to settle this dilemma? You called it a dilemma.
Yeah, well, it's always, there is so much easier to just to talk about the problems and not the solutions. I think that's what we're handling here. Yes, I think there are, I think that if we just look at, for example, we were, just earlier this year, there was a recommendation on the freedom of the internet that was in the Council of Europe. And, you know, there are some indicators there talking about freedom of expression, legality, and proportionality of restrictions, personal data protection, surveillance, and so forth. And we are asking the member states, or they are actually telling themselves that they want to ask themselves to look into this regularly to see, are we actually doing this? So when we are dealing with these national issues with language and culture and so forth, I mean, we also have to take these parameters that we have set in our standard setting and see, are we actually doing it? Or are we going too far in a certain direction?
Okay, thank you. By the way, if you want to comment from the floor, please. This is an open invitation. Go to the microphone or give a signal to Paul.
I will come to you.
So, and you can make a comment. In the meantime...
I think there's a first intervention already. Do we already take? Let me come to you.
There's a mic there.
And please present yourself.
Christian Borgren from the Computer and Communications Industry Association. What we're seeing globally is a worrisome trend towards forced data localization in states. And this is sort of on the rise globally. What we heard yesterday was that Commissioner Oettinger was announcing that there will be a proposal to ban unjustified data localization in EU member states. And I have a question for the panel, whether you think this is a chance for Europe to show leadership.
I think this is a good question, then both to Mariette and to
The answer is yes.
Megan. Mariette, Iceland is not a member of the European Union, so but more or less you are in the same position in the European Parliament with the same questions. Also, you know, this mixture between the national culture and the global internet. What would be your...
Definitely.
Yeah.
So thank you, first of all, for including me. Thank you for the excellent paper that you wrote, which I think sets out the framework for this discussion very well. And I think the interaction between the different layers of fragmentation, territorial, commercial, and technical, are actually most interesting. So if we come back to this notion of a balkanized internet that I think is still used sometimes, or maybe I'm you know, getting old, but I don't think it was only used 20 years ago. I think it is clear that the territorial fragmentation is most known or most analyzed, at least in policy circles. And this also relates to forced data localization and questions of, you know, territorial-based application of the law, which is on itself a, you know, normal starting point for states, but the question is what it leads to. So when we look at forced data localization, I think indeed ending it or banning it would be a great opportunity for Europe to show global leadership. But it's a bit surprising that on the one hand we are quite disturbed about forced data localization, while forced content localization is still something that we have to change, because frankly the portability of content is not yet guaranteed. So the whole promise of the digital single market as such, a space where you can travel with the free flow of goods online, is not yet delivered. But I also think there's a lot of interesting questions if we look more at sort of horizontal fragmentation, if we can call it that, whereas you can look at vertical fragmentation of countries next to each other, trying to apply the law very strictly to their citizens, to their territory, even if it pertains to the internet, such as, for example, the Islamic Republic of Iran, which has isolated its internet, which is now de facto an intranet. You cannot speak of the internet anymore. It's the probably most rigid form of control. But another development of applying the rule of law online, which I think is really related to this discussion of fragmentation, is that where there are no laws, not in countries, not internationally, we see companies de facto setting new norms across borders. And so this, in my analysis of the complexity of this problem, creates another kind of fragmentation where beyond and above nation states certain norms apply. And so it's important, I think, to look at this as a layered challenge, where the question might not be so much about nation state versus hyperconnectivity, but more about models of being open or closed, because the same goes for commercial players, the same goes for companies. And the question of sovereignty as such doesn't, I think, only apply to nation states, which is, you know, the traditional way in which sovereignty is often used, but I would like to think of sovereignty as applying to the individual and his or her universal human rights. And so the way in which we look at this discussion, I think, risks becoming a bit self-serving, because in fora like this, we may easily assume that we agree on the values that we would like to see spread globally, the values underpinning the norms or the laws or the models on which the open internet is built. But I don't think that's the case. I think the question is really from what point of view do we look at it, whether it's territoriality or extraterritoriality. So it's much more a political discussion, I believe, than we sometimes acknowledge. Because, for example, if you look at territoriality from our European point of view right now, we may think it's hindering the open internet. We would be happy if there would be much more global connectivity, no need to see territorial borders hinder the internet use, even for people in countries that do have very centralized, authoritarian, even dictatorial governments, right? We see it from our point of view as an opportunity to allow through VPNs or other ways citizens in other countries, internet users in other places in the world to access the open internet. Despite the law, you know, hooray, victory, we can go around these restrictive laws and people can use the open internet. I think a lot of people in this room, or at least I, see this as an opportunity. And I think a lot of people would in Europe. But the reverse could lead to a different deliberation. So let's say the majority of forces, whether it's states or companies, would actually seek a closed system and would want, through extraterritorial application, want to impact European internet users, want to restrict the openness of the internet, of our values, of our societies, etc. Then we suddenly may think, oh, well, we have to protect our people from this kind of extraterritorial influence. So what I'm trying to say is, beyond the sort of traditional vertical territorial question of sovereignty, of internet governance, the horizontal application of laws is becoming much more interesting. And I think the question is, what direction do we move when there is a new development? Is it towards more openness or towards more closeness, and how do we apply the rule of law online and in a more horizontal manner? These are new questions to a large extent, not entirely new, because in the form of trade or the law of armed conflict or universality of human rights, we have some experience with seeking more horizontal application of agreements across territories. But more than anything, the internet has highlighted the need for applying the rule of law, and if you ask me, hopefully on the basis of universality of human rights horizontally. And that is probably the main challenge.
By the way, I want to welcome Roberto now. He's on the panel. But Mariette, a concrete second question. What is your personal golden balance between the vertical and the horizontal approach? Is the answer on a case-by-case basis, or do we have a general rule how to balance these conflicting values between territoriality, sovereignty, and universal values, which are borderless?
Well, I think, you know, in an ideal world, there would be agreement between commercial actors, individuals, states, about the importance of the universality of human rights, and everybody would see the open internet, access to information, new ways to express oneself, new ways to connect only as an opportunity. But we don't live in the ideal world. So the question is, of course, case by case. I mean, I think we should aspire to keep the internet open and its users free and safe. And that is a big enough challenge as it is. But of course, questions about net neutrality are different from questions about fighting crime, or questions about copyright reform are different from questions about norms of armed conflict related to digital arms, right? So I think we have to look at it case by case, but it helps if you have a view of a broad set of values within which you would like to see the open internet evolve. And my starting point I've tried to make clear. I believe in openness, I believe in universality of human rights, but the challenges are quite significant. And I just wanted to point out that we should not take our starting point for granted, because we are not the majority at the moment globally. And this awareness might help us strategize vis-a-vis those who we have to influence, or the way in which we approach this. Because if we think that extraterritorial application of our laws is normal, then we may be faced with others who would do the same to us one day. And I think that therefore the rule of law and having a rules-based approach that is clear, that is transparent, that is accountable, and that is applicable also in a predictable manner, would be very important. But we are far from that, but those are the questions that we have to answer.
Okay, thank you very much. Just a very brief comment. When you said, okay, in the ideal world, we could have agreement between corporations and governments. I would add also the civil society or the user community.
Oh, absolutely.
What we learned just in another flash session from Fadi Shehade, who is now with the World Economic Forum, he wants to change the terminology from public-private partnership into public-private-civic collaboration. And I think this is really important for the internet. It's really my personal view, and I think we touched this also in the study, that this multi-stakeholder model has to be broken down case by case to all the various issues we have discussed here now. And
so also very brief response. I'm so sorry, I may have taken that for granted too much, but explicitly now absolutely should be inclusive and should serve the public interest, which is sort of my 24/7 occupation, so I sometimes forget to make that explicit. But let's also be a little bit more critical about this multi-stakeholder model. Let's define a little bit more what we mean. I think it is fair to say that people, whether they're in government, whether they're states, whether they are companies with bigger power, whether it's market power, governance power, authority, should also take bigger responsibility. If somebody is at the table, but they have absolutely no influence over outcomes, then you have a multi-stakeholder process, but it leads to a top-down result. So I think we have to, of course, be inclusive to start with, but also be a bit critical and be careful that just multi-stakeholder process doesn't become a meaningless word that can also be abused by those who think, oh, great, we had everybody at the table, but we know we're still making the decisions anyway.
Thank you for this critical touch. Full applause. You see, the audience is on your side. Before we go to the audience, so Roberto, you as a latecomer, to finish the first round, the discussion we have here is now about the political dimension of fragmentation. And some people have argued that, the decisions by the European courts, now we have a number of decisions, which create special obligations for the member states of the European Union, can be seen also as a contribution to a more fragmented internet. Do you have any comment on this argument?
Thank you. First of all, my really deep apologies to you, the fellow panelists, and to you for the delay. I have some influence on the electronic regulation, media, but not on the traffic. So I'm very sorry. I mean, I was completely blocked in Brussels traffic. I think internet is one of the most important gifts that the mankind has recently had. And I think that in a sort of rational behavior by the nation states, by the stakeholder, by us all, the only way to keep this gift a real one is to keep it open. So in a sort of game theory type of approach, you would easily conclude that there's no other alternative game for everyone in the world, but just to keep it open. So I remain optimistic about the future of the internet, because at the end of the day, it's a little bit like the international rules for things like aviation or other sectors of the human life that have changed our life. The instinct, at the end of the day, for everyone, or the incentive, better said, is to cooperate. So my impression is that still we are in the right direction, the positive direction, and in spite of all the problems, the general attitude remains very concentrated, and this is what we are discussing is a proof of this, that we are all very committed to this. But of course, the incentives not to cooperate by certain forces, by certain states, by certain private corporations are also very high. This is, again, the mankind. So we have to remain vigilant, and we have to set examples. And so I'm slowly coming to the answer, don't worry. So in this respect, I believe that Europe is contributing to set an example in terms of subscribing to the values of an open and well-preserved concept of an internet that functions. First of all, because of course, I mean, we are a varied group of citizens with different ideas, but I mean, some of the fundamental values in Europe are in place, which I think are the DNA of this an open internet. To start with, everyone in Europe subscribes to freedom of information, freedom of speech. Of course, I mean, we do have our internal problems, but these are fundamental values of the Union. Secondly, with a lot of struggle, with a lot of pain, still in its implementation, is the only large area of the world which has a legislation on net neutrality. In other cases, there could be a court decision overthrowing the work that has been done, or maybe another administration. In Europe, it will not change so easily. It's rooted now in the DNA of Europe. Third, we know a concept which is called universal service. That's again another DNA of Europe. So having the possibility for every citizen to have access to internet. So the concept of accessibility is part of our DNA. Fourth, the fact that basically we are now fighting, everyone in Europe is fighting for a digital single market. So all the European institutions, the Parliament, the Council, the Commission is committed to create this single market without borders. Is again exactly the opposite of fragmentation. And after the summer, we will present our proposal for free flow of data. So again, in the area of open exchange, of course, we do have our concern about competitiveness of industry, different stakeholders having different ideas. Copyright was mentioned. But this is in a very solid, with a very solid vision of openness of the internet. The court, it's important. I mean, it's the scrutiny of the laws in Europe, and has said very important things about freedom of speech, about freedom of providers on the net. For instance, the court has intervened on the safe harbor principle, one or the other very important principle to have a well-functioning internet ecosystem. So I normally, let's say, it's like the result in a football game. I mean, you might be not happy or whatever, but it's the result. So I tend not to comment what the court is saying, because it's basically judging on what is existing. Of course, our task as European Commission proposing European legislation, and the task of the European institutions deciding on legislation, is to make sure that these founding values of openness, of going in the right direction, which I believe, as I said, is the only direction, are kept. And I think in this, Europe responds well. Now the point is how to make sure that this is the sort of the DNA when we discuss of internet about the rest of the world. Of course, this is no different from any other human activities where, I mean, the like-minded have to do something, and we hope to be many to have the same values. And in this, that's the relevance of the multi-stakeholder community. That's very important. So to me, all the good intentions, also all of the right ingredients to keep the internet open are in place. but of course, at the same time, I mean, all the tendencies to do the reverse are also in place. So we should fight for maintaining the internet open. We should also denounce in every time we see tendencies going in another direction. And that's again and again also the value of the multi-stakeholder community, being also the whistleblower and supporting the public authorities. I hope to go in the right direction.
Thank you very much. I think we got now a good overview about the understanding of fragmentation. Second part is now what to do. So I hand over to Paul, and in the meantime, it's up to Marco to ask a very good provocative question.
Well, if we think about what we do about fragmentation, I want you for just 1 second to close your eyes, and I will just mention a few events that happened since the last EuroDIG in Sofia. The right to be the index clash between the French Data Protection Authority and Google. The case with Microsoft involving the US government and Irish servers. Privacy Shield. The hate speech code of conduct. I think what all those cases, if you think about them, have in common is that they are sort of a symptom of a much bigger systemic challenge, and you all already pointed towards this. If we talk about digital sovereignty on the internet, it's basically digital sovereignty in action is how do our national jurisdictions apply in cyberspace? And our traditional international system is based upon the Westphalian notion of territoriality and borders. And this, we struggled basically to adapt this to the digital realities of the 21st century. Most online interactions nowadays involve simultaneously multiple jurisdictions at once, and they can conflict or overlap. We have the location of users. We have the location of internet companies, their local offices. We have locations of the servers, the registrars, the registries, and they can all be in different jurisdictions. So the challenge, I think, that we are facing is how we apply national jurisdictions without, and this is, I think, when we discuss about fragmentation and what I got from your comments is, yes, we want, and there's one comment that we're still waiting for, we don't want to realign the cross-border internet along our boundaries just so that our traditional tools can cope with it, but at the same time, what can we do about it? And I want to give the floor to Marco because he had a comment, and then I would like to go back to the panel. Please, Marco.
Thank you. Even my laptop fell asleep by now. Hello, Marco Welgewoning, Ripe NCC. I was sort of bridging towards Wolfgang's opening where he said, like, yeah, there's multiple definitions of fragmentation. This is really a hard topic to grasp. What does fragmentation mean? Now, I'm a very technical guy, so taking a really technical perspective, the internet as a network of networks, it's fragmented by default. It's a loose conglomeration of 60,000 odd networks. It's hundreds, thousands of different applications. It's millions of companies. Yet, as Göran rightly said, we talk about one internet. And that is because the whole system is designed to circumvent fragmentation. From the bottom up, at the network level, if you fragment it, if you cut the cable, the system will route around it. That's its only purpose it's designed for, is to get the message to the destination, no matter what. Jumping all the way up the stack into applications, why do these things work together? Jumping to the economical model, interoperability brings mutual benefit. That's where your added value is. Even from a walled garden perspective, the value of a walled garden is that I can charge people access for that walled garden. So yet, the added value of my walled garden comes from the connection with the outside. So, coming to that, then, if you have this system that is so built against fragmentation, then could it actually exist? Could you have a viable model? And that's what I would love to hear from the panelists. is, do you really believe there is a viable model based on fragmentation? Because of course, from a political perspective and at a high level, yes, you can choose to exist in a vacuum. But remember, in space, no one will hear you scream. Thank you.
I think interoperability is a very, very important work, and I would like to go to Göran. Göran, can you tell us more about this sort of technical interoperability that makes the internet be actually a global network? And if I may add a second question.
You want to have a technical description?
From a technical point of view, and what do you think, do we have, or is there a chance for us to have the legal equivalent to this sort of technical interoperability?
Actually, I would like to jump on the previous piece a little bit, because maybe there is a fourth alternative when it comes to fragmentation. And that is when you combine the technical part and the commercial part. And just for a second, think about, I don't know if anyone has heard about things like 5G, which is a marketing discussion very much. But if you've seen some of the proposed specs on that, well, it's a kind of a combination of technical and business, where the kind of intention for some people, some organization, is to reverse the termination of traffic. So this is technical, where today there is no termination, it kind of flows around. In some of the specification for 5G, it's kind of built for that you terminate all traffic into the mobile network. And that takes away a part of interoperability, because what happens then if you have low competition in the mobile space, and there's only one supplier, for instance, and they control through 5G technology the access for the mobile for the end users. And that traffic is kind of contained in the mobile space, in the 5G space. And that's where you're going to be. And then you can actually end up having, if you want to be on that network, if you want to supply a service, if you're Facebook or Microsoft or anyone else, you have to pay to get into that network. So that is a kind of an alternative to the free ones, where you combine business and technical. Interoperability, the way we do things, when we kind of talk about open internet, is about open between routers. And I think that we have to think about that, and the answer to this is very much in the standardization. And the problem is that we kind of coming from two separate worlds. We come from the internet world, and you have the operators who comes from the kind of ITU world. And I think that we have to be careful so we don't end up building silos through standardization. The standardization is going to be very, very important. For coming back to what I originally said, this is about a technology where people get online and can do what they want to do, as long as it's legal. It's very important we keep that notion of it, so we don't, through being naive, think that this new technology could provide us something, because we can actually, if we don't have competition, if we have standards that locks people in, then we really fragmented it, when it's a combination of technical and business.
Very interesting. You mentioned the notion of silos that can be produced by standards. Can you elaborate a tiny bit on this?
There is I can give an example, which I think is kind of interesting. We all use telephones, and then we use something else like voice over IP. The difference is the telephone number. There are more and more service providers now. There's a couple of them in Europe where you can use your telephone number to call for your Wi-Fi network. So you kind of take your telephone call from the ordinary telecom network into the IP world, but you're still using the telephone number. And that is possible because of interoperability. It's because the easiness to connect to those networks. And that, I think, is very positive for the end user. It takes down the price of the call, takes down the transport costs, and you can improve the quality. And you can be reached. You don't have to have... One of the beauties with the telephone number is that you can actually have that and you can be collected wherever you are. If you now kind of contain that traffic in a special network, if you say that, for instance, VoLTE, voice over LTE, which is basic in IP technology, yes, I'm nerdy, will just be contained in one layer. And that's just one service. So you kind of produce the service through standardization, so it only goes through one type of network. And you don't provide the end users the opportunity to have that kind of technology from someone else, because there is no competition there. Then I think there is a real threat for us not having the ability to do what we want. So access, as Roberto talked about, is very, very important.
Very interesting. I want to ask one question to Elfa, because you're wearing multiple hats. At the one hand, you're the chair of the CDMSI, and there are important recommendations with regards to the cross-border data flow, internet freedom, and currently you're working also on new recommendations for online intermediaries. But you're also a representative and a regulator at a small country. From the perspective of Iceland, how do you perceive the challenge of jurisdiction on the internet and the challenge of fragmentation, basically?
Yes, this is a challenging question as well. First of all, I think that we need to keep in mind that if you are living in a small country, there is just no way that all the platforms that the people who are living in this country want to use are going to get into that jurisdiction. So, for example, I don't see a future of being able to buy anything from iStore without having an American address put on my Visa card and a VPN connection. And this is the reality of very many Icelanders. So from that perspective, a digital single market, for example, since we are in the EEA, we would then hope to be connected into the single market. That would be a very big step forward, because then probably we would have a model where all the jurisdictions would be included. However, having said that, having the other hat, which is the traditional media regulator, also which is my day-to-day job, I would have also several questions with that when it comes to, for example, audiovisual services. Mm-hmm. So, for example, how can an audiovisual service provider in a very small country buy content for a big market? Are we going to sell this content on a language basis if we don't have any territory anymore? I mean, how are we going to deal with these questions? So, I mean, so we can have a solution maybe to one problem, but then I think we will also be creating maybe others.
Tatjana, there was a question from you.
Well,
do you want to
I wouldn't call it a question, rather a comment, because I have difficulties with considering these two sides of the debate. When we are talking about fragmentation of the internet, political fragmentation, technical fragmentation, we are talking about something that used to be one, and then it gets fragmented. When we are talking about legal fragmentation, let's be honest, I'm a lawyer, I have been dealing with this for 15 years already. Law is fragmented, especially in the cases which you are talking about, like criminal law. This is the highest degree of governmental intervention. Governments are not easily giving this away. And when we are talking about legal fragmentation, I see rather different trend of trying to bring these regimes together and make them cooperate in transborder and so on. So yes, fragmentation existed, and I mean, I'm sorry, it will exist. Let's live with this. And the question is not how to solve the fragmentation in terms of law, because sometimes we do have law. Look at the European Treaty on Mutual Legal Assistance. There is a provision on direct data transmission. It exists for 16 years, but it never works. So sometimes it's not the question of law, legal or provision, it's a question of how the law operates and an operational side of all this. But my comments was basically that we are trying to bring together these two different issues and square the circle, while I rather see that in technical and political domain we see fragmentation, in jurisdictional domain we see rather movement from fragmentation towards some cooperation.
I would like to take a few more questions. You were waiting over there.
Yeah.
Please introduce yourself.
Yeah, hi, my name is Farzan Abadi. I'm a researcher at EuroDIG. I just have a comment on the assertion that Iran has complete sovereignty over the internet and has actually blocked its user to the global internet, which is not true. We have been talking about halal internet for the past 5-6 years, and it has never happened. And no one discusses with the Iranian government to see what the plan is. These are just kind of, I would call it paranoia at the moment, at this stage. And I think this assertion is dangerous for the good actors in the government who are actually trying to not assert complete sovereignty over Iranian internet and make it open, and also ignoring the kind of civil society that exists in Iran and the activists. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I want to take 2 more questions and then go back to the panel. How many people are currently following remotely, and what is happening on Twitter? If we could get an update from our remote participants, please.
We have a question from remote participant affiliated with the University of Amsterdam. The question is for Mariette, Schaake, Roberto, Viola, and John Frank. To what extent should data flows be regulated by trade agreements? What do you think? Would this be a way to avoid fragmentation of the internet? And the second question from the same person, for Robert, Viola especially, will the free flow of data initiative have an international dimension? And on Twitter, we mostly have comments. If you are interested, I may summarize some of them.
Yes, please.
First of all, why is fragmentation is equated to balkanization, and some discussion related the usage of the term balkanization. Don't you think that this term is too soft, and shouldn't we generate some new term? And some comments are related to, like, the internet does not belong to big companies, and if powerful groups decide, then having consensus at table doesn't mean you have inclusive internet. If powerful groups are those who decide at last. So these are the
Thank you very much for the summary, and please keep those questions in mind. We'll come back to you just after the last comment. Bill, please introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Bill Drake from the University of Zurich, and was one of the authors of the fragmentation paper that was referred to previously. I just wanted to say something about the concept of fragmentation, because I think the ways in which we've been discussing it here have been sometimes a little bit expansive. At least from my standpoint. I tend to think of fragmentation as something that it basically leads to the inability to transfer bits successfully between 2 endpoints. So things that break the ability of people to access, disseminate, and distribute information on an end-to-end basis between endpoints that want to communicate, whether it's commercial, political, or other factors that are doing this. That to me is fragmentation. What I don't think of as fragmentation, and this goes to something that Paul was sort of alluding to, and I think also Tatiana's comment, is simply the existence of variation in the world. Variation in political systems, variation in laws, variation in languages. I've often heard people talk about internationalized domain names as representing fragmentation of the internet. I don't think it represents fragmentation. I think it represents the fact that the world's a big place and lots of people speak lots of different languages, and that's okay. So I'm not that concerned. I mean, there may well be problems that come from issues where countries have different types of legal traditions and there's questions of jurisdiction, and those have to be resolved. But let's not call things fragmentation that are not fragmentation. If we start to do that, then the term stops being useful. It becomes a very expansive kind of Rorschach test onto which anybody can project their hopes, dreams, and visions, and essentially strategically deploy the language to serve their local interests. The reason we tried in this paper that Wolfgang was involved in as well to lay out some baseline for talking about this was, in fact, to try to treat a lot of these different discussions of fragmentation equally and say, okay, look, these are things people are talking about. Which of these do people think are merit for their conversation? So it was a table setting, but it was not an effort to sort of say all the problems in the world, everything in the internet that we don't like should be labeled fragmentation. Fragmentation is a specific sort of thing, I would think. It's reduced interoperability, it's reduced ability to connect endpoints, it's the creation of spaces on the internet where people that are blocked off, segmented, broken, don't allow people to move back and forth. And it's certainly not balkanization. We specifically reject that term for all kinds of reasons.
Thank you very much. There are two more people who are waiting, but I want to give the panelists a bit of the possibility to react to this. And John, there was a question that was directed to you. As a big corporation like Microsoft, you operate in many, many markets all around the world. First of all, how do you perceive the challenge of jurisdiction on a daily basis? And second, there was also the direct question addressed to you. Do you think that trade agreements are a solution in order to avoid unwanted fragmentation?
Being present in so many countries you get a unique perspective. And this conference is people focused on the internet. I get invited to other conferences, sometimes a courtroom, by people focused on law enforcement. And that's their starting point. And I don't think there's any more important function for government than keeping its people safe and secure. And the people in this, dedicating their careers to this are, I have the highest respect for them, but we don't always agree. And national sovereignty is often asserted saying, you need to give me this because it's my national sovereignty. And nations, just an observation, they're better at sort of expressing their wants and needs about their sovereignty as opposed to recognizing when they're perhaps infringing on another country's sovereignty. And we do have to get to a place where we can have a cooperative sovereignty around these issues to meet important social values, but also to do it in ways that I think we can all feel good about. One of an example I want to bring is, in the federal court in New York issued a search warrant, and we went back to the Department of Justice and said, it's for an email account that's stored in our Dublin data center. And they said, we don't care. And we said, but the statute you're operating under doesn't give you extraterritorial powers. And so we've ended up in a litigation, and we're now waiting for the Court of Appeals, and then this case will probably go to the Supreme Court. But it's this important distinction about, where does territoriality sort of begin and end? And in the case isn't going to solve that. It needs to be a cooperative sovereignty. I mean, the member states of the European Union all cooperate in their sovereignty in certain areas. And for law enforcement to work, they have legitimate needs, but they can't do it unilaterally. They need to negotiate, whether it's treaties or something, so that we can work some of these out. But it's important that it not just be government to government and not just companies involved. It is really important to have civil society there, because we get pulled into these discussions and say we want greater cooperation from industry, and it's like, to us that's not open, and it's not a clear standard. We want a law. We want something that users can know what we're doing. And so it's important that civil society and we can, to some extent, be surrogates for our customers, but we can't do that adequately. And ultimately, the democratic process. I mean, it's people who are elected who will make these trade-offs. That's why we have a democratic process. We're happy to participate in the discussion on these issues, and we can work them out, but I think people have to not just understand their needs, but also understand their sovereignty needs may infringe on others, and ultimately a cooperative sovereignty on these issues is important.
This is a very interesting notion, cooperative sovereignty. And Roberto, Viola was mentioning the term prisoner's dilemma and zero-sum game in the beginning. And that makes me think of if we observe what is currently happening on the internet and with the assertion of national laws, there's almost something going on like a legal arms race, that governments try to enforce their national jurisdiction in cyberspace, and this can have unintended consequences. Solutions might look very well and very legitimate in the short term, but if we talk about the internet as one internet and fragmentation, solutions that might look very good in the short term might have unintended long-term effects. Cooperative sovereignty, Marietje, how could this look like? How can we achieve cooperative sovereignty? And the title of the session is also implications for Europe. So what can Europe do to help us achieve this?
So maybe if I can come back to your notion that states are engaged in a legal arms race, I think I question that assumption. I think more than a legal arms race, we see that the speed of technological developments is so much faster than the speed of at least democratic decision-making, that there's actually an increasing vacuum between the reality of a hyper-connected online space and laws, whether in a territory or multilateral space. So I think the vacuum is something that we are trying to address in our discussions, and as a result you see companies being the de facto sovereigns, I think, to a large extent. You see courts stepping in and making decisions on the basis of existing laws. And so, on the one hand, of course, Europe is in a unique position to transcend the national level, because that is what the whole European cooperation is based on. But I think we need more leadership, even though, you know, the digital single market is not the worst of the policy areas in how it's faring, but we need much more ambition, much more vision, and much more pace, because frankly we've been talking about the digital single market for 5-10 years, and we're not near completing it, so we're running behind. I wanted to address the question of the lady about Iran and the Islamic Republic. Let me tell you an anecdote. One of the 3 visits that I paid to that country, and I never take a phone or computer, the first advice somebody gave me was if I needed to go on the internet, they could tell me how to use a VPN. So of course there are people who are able to circumvent the measures of the state, and I'm highly impressed. Sorry, I think, are you responding to me? I know, I'm not, so I'm not 100% finished with answering, but if you have another question, I'd be happy to continue this conversation. So the policy and the law of the state are to centralize and monitor the internet. So to monitor what's happening on it and to censor a number of websites, including mine, but almost all of Western media and others, and a lot of it I can't read because I don't read Farsi. Similarly, speech is restricted, media is restricted, people are not even allowed to have satellites on their roofs for receiving television. Does it mean that they don't do it? No. You see satellites everywhere. Does it mean that the state has a legal basis to prosecute people very, very easily? Yes. And that is, I think, a big problem. So I am not criticizing civil society or the population of Iran for their inventiveness, for their aspirations to access the open internet, and for their ability to do so sometimes. I mean, there's quite a lot of double standards even in the leadership, because you see the supreme leader going on social media, and the same social media is banned in the country itself. But what I think is important is not only to look at those who are able to survive an attack or a limitation of access. Same goes for the comment about a network of networks. The network may recover, but the question is whether all the people trying to connect to the open internet will. So that was related to Iran. So I don't know if this woman has, who asked the question, has another response, but should I answer some of the other questions that were asked?
Maybe we take 2 more questions. Well,
maybe on trade policy, because I work on trade, maybe that's relevant.
Yeah.
As a solution, I don't know.
I think this is a very interesting question, because a lot of people talk about this actually, and they say, is this the solution? Are trade agreements the solution?
Well, again, I think the reason why people look to trade is in the absence of other multilateral or international agreements, because trade is an area where for a bit longer than related to the internet and technology laws and rules have been agreed between states and also pertaining to commercial actors. So it makes sense that people are looking there, but I don't think it's the holy grail. I mean, I think there's an opportunity because we can see how we can extend trade to protect the open internet. And sometimes there's an overlap. For example, mass censorship or blocking certain services from a country can also be seen as protectionism. And free trade or rules-based trade is intended to strengthen fair trade, which should not allow this kind of protectionism or blocking certain companies from certain countries. So I think it's an opportunity to build on existing law. I think that there's generally an opportunity to build on existing law instead of trying to invent all kinds of new agreements. And I think there's also an opportunity to connect the economic interest that states may have to keep the internet open to the benefits it would bring to users more broadly. I think oftentimes states that in principle seek to have more top-down governance or seek to restrict the internet access, for example, in their country, could be persuaded to be careful with doing that, not necessarily on the basis of human rights or open internet arguments, but more on the basis of economic arguments. And of course, on the technical layer, there's a lot of mutual dependence. Yeah. Of course, there are different aspects about the services running over it. And I think the opportunity lies in connecting the notion of mutual dependence between states who may seek to carve themselves out of the global system.
Thank you. I want to give the mic to this very patient gentleman on the right. Sir? Or, yes, please go ahead and introduce yourself.
Valentina Pellitzer, One World, Bosnia-Herzegovina Civil Society. I would like just to highlight the fragmentation bias that exists, not only about the Balkans. The Romans had divided impera, and it's considered power and a good strategy from the powerful. And also about this cooperative sovereignty, I thought the sovereignty was given by the citizens to the government, one person, one vote. And we talk about trade. There are a lot of secret trades. So we hear in the public, we talk about something, and then we have things like the TTIP, which is regulating internet too, which happen behind the closed door. So this is just a jargon good word, or we're really talking about actual things? Thank you.
Thank you. Thomas, please introduce yourself.
Thank you. My name is Thomas. I work for the Swiss government and I'm busy with ICANN and a few other institutions. My name is Thomas Schneider from Switzerland government. I wanted to quickly react on what Elva had said, but also Bill, thank you for your intervention with regard to the agreement. I think that the opposite of fragmentation is not necessarily harmonization, but rather interoperability of, to some extent, different regimes, because we have different cultures that have different ways of doing things or different preferences. I come from a small country with 4 cultures, where we have quite different ways of doing things, even within very small regions. Things vary, and you should allow for this. And I'm not a technology expert, but from what I know, actually the internet allows for different regimes, different technical systems to use the same infrastructure, to coexist on the same infrastructure. So also technically this is not impossible. Not everything needs to be the same, that uses the same ways of communications. And also, like the digital single market or harmonization has challenges, in particular if you take the audiovisual sector for small countries like Iceland or even Switzerland, which is linked to some issues of the geo-blocking. We cannot pay if you have to compete with bigger areas or bigger countries or cultural spheres. We cannot compete in buying for television rights for a football game of the UEFA or what else with the others. So this is why, for instance, if I want to watch my team playing in Switzerland and I can watch it on my public service broadcaster, if I happen to be on holiday in Spain because the Swiss TV broadcaster doesn't have the right to make this accessible in Spain, I cannot watch my team playing because I'm in Spain fortunately, I have a VPN of my government computer, so I get an IP address from Bern, and then I can watch it on my computer. But I mean, not everybody has this privilege. There are some issues that we need to think about when we talk about harmonization, and normally the small ones in these games, and that goes also for the trade agreements. If the big ones make the trade agreements, the small ones, sometimes they are not included, so there's no transparency, they are not heard, and then so there are some challenges with this, and so I think we should really think of this diversity and foster this diversity, which is also one of the reasons for innovation, because if everybody does things in the same way, there will be no new ideas coming up, or less new ideas. So I'd rather go for interoperability and portability also. So if I'm a Swiss citizen that pays my public service broadcast, I would actually like to use their services if I'm somewhere else in the world, because I'm still paying their services, which is actually not feasible at the moment. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this question and for highlighting again the sort of need to have a discussion on what is the legal equivalent to the technical interoperability that has made the internet possible in the way that we have it today. Please, I want to take one more question and then go back to the panel.
Yeah, thank you very much. Theo Wells, European Committee on Democracy and Governance at the Council of Europe. But allow me to digress just 1 minute on the word Iran. I have a friend who has a lot of access to the World Wide Web, but he also has worldwide feet. He's currently walking around the world, and he's in Russia and updating every day. He just last week walked through Moscow and is continuing. But what struck me was his remark about Iran. He was on the web a couple of years ago, running around the world, 50,000 kilometers over a period of 4 years, and he said that the best and greatest hospitality he had found and the most help with getting access to the internet was in Iran. So that's a little positive comment so that we don't stereotype. The gentleman from Switzerland raises an issue, and that keeps coming back to me, is that when we talk about human rights and the rule of law here, and it was fortunately specified a little bit by Marietje, Schaake and by Mr. Viola, and extended a little bit, I keep having the notion that we're talking about consumer rights, the way you discuss users. So what I'm afraid of is that rather than the technical fragmentation, which was correctly defined by Bill, we're also looking at a fragmentation of human beings with progress of the internet, which was supposed to, coming back to Mr. Viola's statement, a gift to mankind. If it is supposed to be a gift to mankind, we shouldn't look at it as an issue that, in my feeling, is being defined by dollar democracy, or pound democracy, or euro democracy, if we want to, just to refer to the currency. Because all of this multi-stakeholder discussion, when you're looking at it, and it is what the panelist last night said, it's about power. The bigger you are, the more money you have, the more power you have, and the more access you have to policymakers. So I think that when you're talking about governance, it's about service delivery, but it is also about public service delivery. If you want to maximize that value, public and civil service value of the internet, then I would like to see it included in governance discussions. Because otherwise, what we will have is consumer choice. But when I studied psychology in the US in 1978, or my daughter studies psychology now, one of the big elements is how do you apply psychology to consumers and how do you influence consumers? So while the consumer has a choice, big platforms, big providers, big intermediaries are doing everything they can to limit that choice 100%. And what concerns me in that is that they think in market share and not in terms of public service and civil service, which is the good, democratic good, and choices, freedom of speech, but also freedom to access the information you need to create an informed opinion so that you can make the right choices. And that concerns me.
Thank you very much. Would you like to react to this?
Thank you very much. Well, There are many points I like to touch, but of course I cannot keep you the whole night. But first, a comment when the essential feature of the internet was evoked, that the internet resists to everything. But some of you might remember why. It was designed as a military tool to resist a nuclear attack. So it's a paradox that such a beautiful tool for openness and free speech actually comes from a military project. But that's really positive that it evolved this way. And now I think the one thing I want to say is that are we happy with the internet as it is? No, of course, it can be much better. So one of the reasons why I decided to reorganize DG Connect is this one, because I want to invest capital in contributing to the internet in 10 years from now. And we will start a project of the internet of the future. Of course, we will not say what is who are we to say what is the internet of the future, but we will be open to ideas. So we will start a cooperative platform and of course invest also some funds for this to really attract all the best ideas on how the internet is going to be. What is my instinct? Well, I would like to have an internet of the humans in the future. So an internet that recognizes me and I can decide what to say, what not to say, or what to pass as my private information about my connected watch, my connected jacket, or my connected tie. So I want to decide whether Mr. X, Y, Z, being a private company, being a government, will have access to my information. Today this is not possible, because all what we do in internet is application dependent, is silo dependent. I mean, so that particular social media network, that particular engine recognizes only the setting for that particular ecosystem. Most of the people don't know, and so basically they give away themselves very quickly, very easily. The internet of future I dream is an internet that recognizes human beings and what they want to say, what they don't want to say, what they want to do, what they don't want to do. So join the project and we'll be really open to all possible ideas. But that's, of course, part of what we have to do in the future. What we have to do in the present, indeed, I mean, is improve it technically in the short term, interoperability, Göran has commented on this, and then there's the political dimension. So the question is this cooperation model, this new way of doing things going to work? Maybe it's not that new. I mean, it's called the Society of Nations doing something for living better together. Now, what is notable is, and Marietje has said it, sometimes there are people using the multi-stakeholder model to their interest. I mean, say, oh, wow, we should not decide. I mean, there's a multi-stakeholder community act. But that's the responsibility of people having a public function. So, for instance, I would say why the like-minded nations of the world do not subscribe a common charter. And this will be the basis of a commitment to avoid the fragmentation of the internet, to keep it open. Of course, it has to be implemented by the multi-stakeholder society, but they commit. And this is important because being a little bit more specific, when you look at international private law and the Hague process, for instance, Europe is present, is there, but not every G7 country is there. So I think to cooperate, we have to be more than one to cooperate and to be like-minded. And I think also it's interesting to see that it's a process that can start even when there are tensions. The treaty, the UN treaty on the peaceful use of the outer space was signed in a moment very complicated for the world during the Cold War, and it was signed. So I think it's possible to actually propose a model of cooperation to which the nation states should show commitment. And this is not in contradiction with the multi-stakeholder community. We should remain at the center of being the governance of the internet ecosystem. But then there should be a commitment by the nation states. Trade agreements, they are an important tool. I mean, they are a tool for progress. They are a tool if they are well used. I mean, this is the recent economic history of the world. So we should not really rush to say this is all bad. This is, I mean, we have to be critical. We have to work towards having good agreements. What we cannot trade are fundamental rights, and we will never do that. So we are not ready to sign a trade agreement trading out in fundamental. These are not for trade agreements. These are, again, for the states to guarantee as part of their DNAs. The free flow of data, indeed, is a concept that can be extended, but to countries that subscribe to a really free and open internet.
Thank you very
maybe just a little point on content portability. It's a joke. Switzerland and Iceland can join the EU. We will have it in October.
We need more members if somebody leaves.
Thank you very much. I think this was a very interesting panel. We touched upon a lot of different questions and we reached the end in terms of time. But I think one thing that is very important in those discussions is to remember why we discuss this. If we talk about fragmentation, the underlying question is not what is positive fragmentation, because we all sort of agree that elements of fragmentation can be very good as well. But the question is, what is unwanted fragmentation? What is the sort of fragmentation we do not want to have? And what unwanted fragmentation is triggered intentionally? And even worse, what unwanted fragmentation is triggered with the best of intentions, but might end up on a more global systemic level of producing exactly a zero-sum game. And I think we also need to keep in mind that we're discussing about what kind of internet we want to have for the next generations of internet users to come, the people who are born today, who are digital natives. What kind of internet will they have in 20 years? And I think this should be one of the guiding questions if we talk about fragmentation or unwanted or negative fragmentation. It's the sort of internet that was created by mankind that we need to preserve, because without action, without policy action, without multi-stakeholder operation, we will not be able to preserve the global nature of the internet, because so far we have not yet achieved the sort of legal equivalent to the technical interoperability that has made the internet so successful and generated all the benefits for mankind. So thank you very much for this great discussion. And well, we're coming close to the closing of the EuroDIG.